in the heart of Asturias, where the mountains brood and the mists never quite lift. There is a story that the old women still whisper when the wind howls through the village streets. They say that if you walk the narrow path past the abandoned house on the hill, you can hear the echoes of laughter, three voices, entwined in a melody that chills the blood. The Calderón sisters. They call them wives to one man, mothers to a lineage so tightly woven that even the bravest villagers cross themselves at the mention of their name. No one remembers exactly when the legend began, only that it has always been there, like the damp in the stone walls or the shadow that falls across the valley at dusk. Some say the sisters were cursed, others that they made a pact with something older and darker than the church bells that once rang in the village square. Children dare each other to climb the hill at night, to peer through the broken windows and see if the sisters' eyes still watch from the darkness within. But the truth, as it so often is stranger and far more terrifying than the stories told by firelight. What really happened in that house on the hill? What secret did the Calderón sisters guard so fiercely that it twisted their bloodline for generations? Tonight, we will walk the path between myth and memory, peeling back the layers of fear and fascination that have kept this story alive. If you think you know the limits of love, loyalty, and madness, think again. The Calderón sisters' tale is not for the faint of heart. Are you ready to hear what the villagers still feared to speak aloud? Asturias in 1938 was a land caught between worlds, one foot in the ancient, the other stumbling through the wreckage of the modern. The war had left its scars not only on the bodies of men, but on the very bones of the earth. The hills, once lush and green, now bore the pockmarks of artillery and the silent graves of those who had vanished in the night. Yet, even in the aftermath, the land clung to its wild beauty. The mountains rose like sentinels, their peaks shrouded in perpetual mist, and the forests pressed close around the villages, as if trying to shield them from the outside world. In the valleys, the fields were a patchwork of green and brown, where oxen pulled wooden plows through stubborn soil, and women bent low to gather what little the earth would yield. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint tang of fear. Every morning, the church bell tolled, not so much to call the faithful as to remind the living that they had survived another night. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered, stretching long and cold across the land. The village itself was a cluster of stone houses, their walls mottled with lichen and age, roofs sagging under the weight of too many winters. Narrow lanes twisted between them, muddy and rutted, lined with the detritus of lives lived close to the bone. Children played in the dirt, their laughter sharp and fleeting, while their mothers watched from doorways, eyes weary and tired. Men gathered in the tavern, voices low, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting the past to come knocking. Isolation was both a curse and a shield. The mountains kept the world at bay, but they also trapped the villagers in a web of old beliefs and older fears. Superstition was the true law here, older than the Republic, older than the Church. Every illness had its omen, every misfortune its whispered cause. The villagers spoke of witches and spirits, of curses that could be called down with a glance or a careless word. The Calderón family, perched on the edge of the village in their crumbling house, were both part of this world and apart from it, respected for their land, feared for their secrets. Poverty pressed in on all sides. The war had taken the men, the crops, the certainty of tomorrow. Hunger gnawed at bellies and hope alike. Yet, in the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky burned with impossible colors, there was a kind of peace. The villagers would gather in the square, sharing what little they had, telling stories to keep the darkness at bay. It was in these moments, as the firelight flickered and the shadows danced, that the legend of the Calderón sisters would surface, half warning, half confession. The Calderón house stood apart, a silhouette against the sky, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The path that led to it was overgrown, the gate hanging crooked on its hinges. Some said the house was cursed, that the land itself had turned against the family. Others whispered that the sisters had brought their fate upon themselves, that their choices had twisted the very fabric of their bloodline. but no one dared speak too loudly, for fear that the walls themselves might be listening. In this world of beauty and brutality, of faith and fear, the Calderón sisters grew up. Their story was shaped by the land that bore them, by the war that broke their world, and by the secrets that festered in the silence between heartbeats. To understand what happened in that house on the hill, you must first understand the world that made it possible, a world where the line between the living and the dead, the sacred and the profane, was as thin as the morning mist. And in 1938, that mist was thicker than ever. Maria Lucia and Inés Calderón were born into a world that offered little in the way of comfort, but much in the way of mystery. The eldest, Maria, arrived on a storm-tossed night in 1918, her first cries mingling with the thunder that rattled the windows of the old house on the hill. Lucia followed 2 years later, her birth marked by a rare break in the Klotza shaft of sunlight that, for a moment, made the world seem almost kind. Inés, the youngest, came last, in the bitter winter of 1923, when the village was buried under snow, and the only warmth was the fire that flickered in the Calderón hearth. From the beginning, the sisters were inseparable, bound by more than blood. Their mother, a stern woman with eyes like polished coal, kept them close, teaching them the old ways, how to read the weather and the flight of birds, how to ward off illness with salt and prayer, how to keep secrets. Their father, a quiet man, broken by the war, spent his days tending the fields and his nights staring into the flames, haunted by things he would never speak aloud. Maria, the eldest, was the protector. She moved through the world with a quiet strength, her dark hair always pulled back, her gaze steady and unflinching. She was the one who comforted Lucia when nightmares came, who shielded Inés from their mother's sharp tongue. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Maria carried a weight of responsibility that would one day threaten to crush her. Lucia was the dreamer. She saw beauty where others saw only hardship, wildflowers growing between the stones, patterns in the frost on the window pane. She sang to herself as she worked, her voice a soft counterpoint to the silence of the house. But Lucia's dreams were fragile things, easily bruised by the harshness of reality. She longed for escape, for a world beyond the mountains, yet she was always the first to return when her sisters called. Inés, the youngest, was the watcher. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. She moved like a shadow through the house, listening at doors, collecting secrets like pebbles in her pocket. The villagers said she had the sight, that she could sense things others could not. Whether this was true or simply the product of gossip, Inés never said. She kept her own counsel, her loyalty fierce and unyielding. The sisters' childhood was marked by small joys and quiet sorrows. They played in the fields, weaving crowns of wildflowers and chasing each other through the tall grass. On rainy days, they huddled together in the attic, telling stories by candlelight, tales of witches and saints, of lost loves and broken promises. They learned early that the world was not a safe place, that trust was a rare and precious thing. Yet, for all their differences, the sisters were united by a bond that nothing could break. They shared everything: hopes, fears, even the small, hard kernel of loneliness that grew in each of them. The world outside their home was cold and suspicious, but within the walls of the Calderón house, they found warmth in each other. Still, shadows crept in at the edges. Their mother's warnings grew sharper as they grew older. Never let a stranger cross the threshold. Never speak of what you see in this house. The war had left the village wary, and the Calderón name carried a weight of its own. The sisters learned to keep their heads down, to move quietly through the world, to trust only each other. As they entered adolescence, the differences between them deepened. Maria became more withdrawn, her sense of duty hardening into something like steel. Lucia's laughter grew rarer, her dreams tinged with longing and regret. Inés watched them both, her silence growing heavier with each passing year. There were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when the sisters glimpsed the darkness that waited for them. A neighbor's child fell ill, and the whispers began. The Calderón girls accursed. A stray dog was found dead on their doorstep, and their mother burned sage at every window. The sisters clung to each other, their bond, both shield and shackle. Empathy for the sisters comes easily, for who among us has not felt the weight of expectation, the sting of suspicion, the ache of wanting to belong? Yet, even as we root for them, we sense the gathering storm. The innocence of their childhood is already fraying at the edges, shadows lengthening in the corners of their world. The choices they will make out of love, out of fear, out of desperation will echo far beyond the walls of the Calderón house. And so, the sisters grew, three threads woven tightly together, unaware that the loom of fate was already turning, drawing them inexorably toward the darkness that would define their lives. It was the spring of 1937 when Don Emilio first appeared in the village, a time when the wounds of war were still raw and every stranger was met with suspicion. He arrived on foot, his boots caked with the red mud of distant roads, a battered suitcase in one hand and a wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes. No one saw where he came from, and no one could say for certain what drew him to this forgotten corner of Asturias. But from the moment he set foot in the square, the air seemed to shift, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Don Emilio was not a handsome man in the way of storybook heroes. His features were sharp, almost fox-like, with a thin mouth and eyes the color of storm clouds. Yet there was something about him, a quiet confidence, a way of moving that suggested he was always 2 steps ahead. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low and measured, each word chosen with care. The villagers watched him from behind their curtains, whispering among themselves. Some said he was a merchant, others a deserter, still others a man, running from a past too dark to name. The Calderón sisters first saw him from the window of their house, his figure small against the vastness of the hills. Maria, ever the protector, felt a prickle of unease. Lucia, the dreamer, was captivated by the mystery of him, her imagination spinning stories before she even knew his name. Inés, silent and watchful, simply observed, her dark eyes following his every move. Don Emilio took a room at the inn, paying in coins that looked too new for a man so worn. He kept to himself, but it was not long before he found his way to the Calderón house. He came under the pretense of seeking work help with the fields, repairs to the roof, anything to earn his keep. Their mother, wary but practical, agreed. Men was scarce, and the land was unforgiving. From the start, Don Emilio was different from the other men the sisters had known. He listened when they spoke, his gaze never lingering too long, his compliments subtle and sincere. He brought small gifts, wildflowers for Lucia, a book of poetry for Maria, a carved wooden bird for Inés. He never pressed, never demanded, but his presence was a constant, unsettling hum in the background of their days. The village watched with growing suspicion. Outsiders were rare, and those who stayed were rarer still. The old women muttered that nothing good ever came from the outside, that the Calderón girls were tempting fate by letting him into their home. The men eyed him with a mixture of envy and distrust, their own failures reflected in his easy competence. For the sisters, Don Emilio was a catalyst, stirring feelings they had long kept buried. Maria found herself drawn to his steadiness, the way he seemed to understand the burdens she carried. Lucia was swept up in the romance of it all, imagining herself the heroine of a story where love could conquer even the darkest of fates. Inés, ever the observer, saw the cracks beneath his calm exterior, the moments when his mask slipped and something colder flickered in his eyes. The courtship was slow, almost ritualistic. Don Emilio never favored one sister over the others, instead weaving himself into the fabric of their lives. He worked alongside them in the fields, shared their meals, listened to their stories. By the fire, he became a fixture in the house, his presence both comfort and complication. Desire and duty warred within the sisters. Maria felt the weight of responsibility, torn between her own longing and her duty to protect her family. Lucia, intoxicated by the possibility of escape, dreamed of a life beyond the village, her heart beating faster whenever Don Emilio was near. Inés, sensing the storm to come, grew quieter still, her eyes dark with secrets. The village, for its part, grew restless. Rumors spread like wildfire, Some said Don Emilio was a spy, others that he had bewitched the sisters. The priest warned their mother to be vigilant, to remember the dangers of temptation. But the Calderón house, once a fortress against the world, was now a stage for a drama that none of them could control. In the evenings, as the sun set behind the mountains and the shadows lengthened, the sisters would gather in the kitchen, their voices low and urgent. They spoke of Don Emilio, of what he wanted, of what they wanted. The air was thick with longing and fear, the boundaries between them shifting in ways they could not name. Don Emilio, for his part, seemed to sense the tension. He moved through the house like a ghost, present but never fully there, his eyes always searching, always calculating. He spoke of the future in vague terms, never promising, never committing. Yet, with every passing day, he drew the sisters deeper into his orbit, binding them to him with threads of hope and desperation. The contrast between the outsider and the insular village could not have been starker. Don Emilio was a man of the world, shaped by forces the sisters could barely imagine. The village was a closed circle, its rules and rituals as old as the stones in the churchyard. Desire clashed with duty, love with loyalty, the promise of something new with the comfort of the familiar. And so, the stage was set. The Calderón sisters, once united against the world, now found themselves divided by a man who was both savior and destroyer. The village watched, waiting for the inevitable reckoning. For in a place where secrets festered and the past was never truly buried, nothing stayed hidden for long. The arrival of Don Emilio was not the beginning of their story, but the spark that would ignite everything that followed. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a choice made in desperation. The Calderón sisters, once bound by the simple certainties of childhood, now found themselves entangled in a web of longing, fear, and necessity. Don Emilio's presence in their home had become a fact, as immovable as the mountains themselves. He was no longer just a guest or a laborer. He was the axis around which their lives began to turn. The village, ever watchful, had started to whisper. Why did Don Emilio linger so long at the Calderón house? Why did he never court any of the other village girls? Why did the sisters, once so private, now seem to move in his shadow? The sisters felt the weight of these questions pressing in on them, tightening like a noose. Their mother, sensing the danger, grew more anxious with each passing day. She warned them, pleaded with them, but the sisters were already caught in the current, swept along by forces they could neither name nor resist. It was Maria who first spoke the unthinkable aloud. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, she gathered her sisters in the kitchen. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she laid out the truth. Don Emilio had made his intentions clear. He would marry, but he would not choose between them. He wanted them all, or he would leave. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lucia wept, her dreams of a simple, romantic escape crumbling to ash. Ines stared into the flames, her face unreadable. Maria, always the protector, felt the old ache of responsibility settle in her bones. They all knew what was at stake. Without Don Emilio, the farm would fail. They would be left alone, vulnerable to the hunger and suspicion that stalked the village. With him, there was a chance, however, slim of survival. But survival came at a price. To share a husband was to invite scandal, to risk the wrath of the church and the contempt of their neighbors. It was to break the most sacred of taboos, to step outside the boundaries that had kept their world intact for generations. Yet, as the sisters looked at one another, they saw not just fear, but a fierce, desperate love. They had always been each other's shelter. Could they not, together, weather this storm as well? The pact was made in whispers, sealed with tears and trembling hands. They would share Don Emilio, each sister taking her turn, each sacrificing a piece of herself, for the sake of the others. It was not a decision made lightly, nor one made without regret. But in that moment, it felt like the only choice left to them. Don Emilio accepted their terms with a calm that bordered on indifference. He divided his time between the sisters, careful to show no favoritism, careful to keep the peace. To the outside world, He was simply a hard-working man who had married into a troubled family. Only the sisters and the walls of the Calderón house knew the truth. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. Maria, who had always carried the burdens of her family, now found herself haunted by guilt and shame. She watched her sisters for signs of resentment, for cracks in the fragile peace they had built. Lucia, whose heart had always yearned for something more, felt herself shrinking, her dreams growing smaller with each passing day. She tried to find solace in the small moments, Emilio's hand on hers, a shared laugh, a whispered promise, but the knowledge that she was not his only love gnawed at her soul. Ines, ever the watcher, retreated further into herself. She became the keeper of secrets, the silent witness to the tensions that simmered beneath the surface. She saw the way Maria's eyes lingered on Emilio when she thought no one was looking, the way Lucia's laughter grew brittle, the way Emilio himself seemed to grow more distant with each passing week. Ines understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their pact was a fragile thing, held together by hope and fear in equal measure. Keeping the secret became a second life, a performance that demanded constant vigilance. The sisters learned to move in careful patterns, to avoid the prying eyes of the village. They took turns attending church, took care never to be seen together with Emilio in public. Their mother, complicit in their deception, became a master of misdirection, spinning stories to explain away the oddities of their household. But secrets, like wounds, have a way of festering. The sisters found themselves growing apart, each retreating into her own private world of longing and regret. Arguments flared over the smallest things: a misplaced cup, a careless word, a look that lingered too long. The love that had once bound them now became a source of pain, a reminder of all they had lost. And yet, for all the suffering, there were moments of grace, on quiet nights when the world outside seemed far away. The sisters would sit together by the fire, their hands entwined, their hearts beating in uneasy harmony. They spoke little, but in their silence was a kind of understanding, a recognition that, whatever the future held, they would face it together. How did they keep this secret? With fear, with cunning, with a love that was both their salvation and their curse. The Calderón sisters became experts in the art of concealment, their lives a delicate dance on the edge of disaster. But even the most carefully guarded secrets cannot remain hidden forever. The pact they had made, born of desperation and devotion, would shape not only their own fates, but the fate of every generation that followed. And so, the sisters lived, day by day, beneath the weight of their choice. The world outside remained unchanged, but within the walls of the Calderón house, everything was different. The pact was both shield and shackle, a bond that would hold them together even as it threatened to tear them apart. The Calderón house, perched on its lonely rise above the village, had always seemed a place apart. Its stone walls, thick with moss and memory, held the cold even in summer. The windows, narrow and deep-set, let in little light, and the wind that swept down from the mountains seemed to circle the house with a kind of hungry patience. To the villagers below, it was a place of whispered stories and uneasy glances, a house that watched and remembered. Inside, the sisters moved through their days with a careful choreography, each step measured, each word weighed. The routines that had once brought comfort now felt like rituals, performed not out of habit but necessity, as if the very fabric of their lives depended on their precision. Every morning, Maria would rise before dawn, her footsteps echoing in the silent halls as she stoked the kitchen fire and set water to boil. She moved with a quiet determination, her face set in lines of resolve, as if she could keep the darkness at bay through sheer force of will. Lucia, always the last to wake, would drift into the kitchen with sleep still clinging to her eyes. She would hum softly as she kneaded bread, her voice a fragile thread of hope in the heavy air. Ines, silent and watchful, would appear without warning, slipping into the room like a shadow. She would set the table, her movements precise, her eyes flickering from sister to sister, always alert for the first sign of discord. Don Emilio, for his part, had become a ghostly presence in the house. He moved between the sisters with a practiced ease, careful never to linger too long in any one room. He spent his days in the fields or the workshop, his nights divided by a schedule that none of them spoke of but all obeyed. The arrangement, so carefully constructed, was a fragile piece, one that demanded constant vigilance. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. The sisters, once so close, now found themselves drifting apart, their conversations stilted, their laughter forced. Small slights became wounds, old grievances resurfaced. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing day. It was in the rituals that the first signs of something deeply wrong began to appear. The sisters had always observed certain traditions, lighting candles for the dead, sprinkling salt at the thresholds, hanging sprigs of rosemary above the doors. But now, these acts took on a feverish intensity. Maria would spend hours scrubbing the floors with vinegar, muttering prayers under her breath. Lucia began to collect odd trinkets, feathers, bones, bits of colored glass which she arranged in careful patterns on her windowsill. Ines, always the most sensitive, started to keep a journal of her dreams, recording every detail with a meticulous hand. At night, the house seemed to come alive with strange sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant echo of footsteps in empty rooms. The sisters would lie awake, listening, their hearts pounding in the darkness. Sometimes, they would gather in the kitchen, drawn together by a fear they could not name. They would sit in silence, the only light the flicker of a single candle, their faces pale and drawn. The rituals grew more elaborate as the weeks passed. On the first night of the new moon, Maria insisted they perform a cleansing ceremony their mother had taught them, meant to drive away evil spirits. They gathered in the parlor, the air thick with the scent of burning sage, and recited the old prayers in trembling voices. Lucia wept as she scattered salt in the corners of the room, while Ines traced protective symbols on the windows with ash. Don Emilio watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. But the sense of unease only deepened. The sisters began to notice small things out of place: a door left open, a cup moved from its usual spot, a cold draft where none should be. Lucia swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden one night, its face hidden in shadow. Maria dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Ines began to sleep with a knife beneath her pillow. The house itself seemed to turn against them. The walls, once solid and reassuring, now felt porous, as if something was seeping in from the outside. The mirrors grew cloudy, reflecting not their faces, but something darker, something that flickered at the edge of sight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and old secrets. Paranoia took root. The sisters began to suspect one another of jealousy, of betrayal, of harboring secrets too terrible to share. Maria accused Lucia of neglecting her chores, of spending too much time staring out the window. Lucia snapped back, accusing Maria of trying to control everything, of suffocating them with her rules. Ines, caught between them, withdrew further, her silence growing more ominous with each passing day. Don Emilio, sensing the growing tension, became more distant. He spent longer hours in the fields, returning only when the sun had set. When he was home, he spoke little, his eyes darting from sister to sister, as if searching for an answer to a question he could not ask. The fragile piece of their arrangement began to unravel, replaced by a simmering resentment that threatened to boil over at any moment. The villagers, ever watchful, began to notice the change. They spoke in hushed tones of strange lights in the Calderón windows, of voices raised in anger, of shadows moving behind the curtains. Some claimed to hear weeping late at night, carried on the wind from the house on the hill. Others swore they saw the sisters walking the fields at dawn, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes haunted. The house, once a place of laughter and light, had become a crucible, a place where secrets festered and rituals offered only the illusion of safety. The sisters clung to their routines, desperate for a sense of control, but the darkness pressed in on all sides. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the first seeds of madness were sown. In the end, It was not a single event that marked the beginning of the end, but a slow, inexorable unraveling. The sisters, bound by love and fear, found themselves trapped in a cycle of suspicion and regret. The house on the hill, with its secrets and its rituals, became both their refuge and their tormentor, a silent witness to the darkness that had taken root in their hearts. And as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the Calderón sisters realized that some secrets could not be kept forever. The rituals that had once protected them now felt like chains, binding them to a fate they could neither escape nor understand. The house watched and waited as the shadows lengthened and the first true cracks began to appear. The first child was born in the spring, when the apple trees in the Calderón orchard were heavy with blossom and the air was thick with the promise of rain. Maria's labor was long and silent, her cries muffled behind closed doors, the rest of the house holding its breath. When the baby finally arrived, a boy, dark-haired and solemn-eyed, the sisters gathered around him in awe and terror, as if they had summoned something both miraculous and monstrous into the world. Within a year, Lucia followed, her daughter, arriving on a night when thunder rolled over the hills and the village huddled in their beds, counting the seconds between lightning and the shuddering earth. Inés, always the last, gave birth in the dead of winter, her child's first breath, a cloud of steam in the frigid air. 3 children, 3 mothers, 1 father. The Calderón house, once echoing with silence, now rang with the cries of infants and the soft, exhausted lullabies of women who had given everything to keep their secret. The village, already wary of the Calderóns, watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. At first, the births were met with the usual rituals, gift of bread and salt, whispered blessings at the church door. But as the months passed and the truth became impossible to ignore, the mood shifted. The children, so close in age, so eerily alike, became the subject of endless speculation. Whose child was whose? Why did they all share the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jaw? The villagers began to cross themselves when the Calderón children passed, muttering prayers against the evil eye. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the sisters had made a pact with the devil, trading their souls for fertility. Others whispered that Don Emilio was not the true father, that the children were the result of some older, darker magic. The priest, caught between pity and condemnation, warned his flock to keep their distance, to pray for the souls of the innocent. The Calderón children grew up in the shadow of these stories, their every move watched, their every word weighed. As the years passed, the Calderón lineage grew. Each sister bore more children, the house filling with the sound of small feet and the chaos of too many lives lived in too small a space. The children, bound by blood and circumstance, formed a tribe apart. They played together in the fields, their laughter echoing through the valley. But even in their games, there was a sense of something closed, something impenetrable. Outsiders were not welcome. The Calderón children trusted only each other. The physical similarities among the children became impossible to ignore. They shared the same dark hair, the same pale skin, the same eyes that seemed to see more than they should. As they grew older, other traits emerged: an uncanny intelligence, a tendency toward silence, a wariness that bordered on paranoia. Some of the children were sickly, plagued by mysterious ailments that no doctor could explain. Others were gifted, able to recite prayers in Latin before they could walk, or to solve complex puzzles with frightening ease. The villagers, already suspicious, began to speak of a curse. They pointed to the children's oddities as proof that the Calder or NES had defied the natural order, that their bloodline was tainted. Stories circulated of children born with webbed fingers, of twins who spoke in their own secret language, of a boy who could predict the weather with uncanny accuracy. Whether these tales were true or simply the product of fear and envy, they took on a life of their own, passed from mouth to mouth until they became part of the village's collective memory. Inside the Calderón house, the sisters did their best to shield their children from the world's cruelty. They taught them to be wary, to keep their secrets close, to trust no one outside the family. But the children, sensitive to the tension that simmered beneath the surface, absorbed their mother's fears and resentments. They learned early that love could be both a blessing and a weapon, that loyalty could suffocate as easily as it could protect. The psychological toll was profound. Some of the children grew up angry, lashing out at anyone who dared to question their place in the world. Others withdrew, retreating into silence or strange obsessions. A few, desperate for acceptance, tried to ingratiate themselves with the other village children, only to be rebuffed and mocked. The Calderón name became a curse, a mark that set them apart no matter how hard they tried to blend in. As the years went by, the family's isolation deepened. The sisters, once so close, now found themselves divided by the demands of motherhood and the weight of their secret. Arguments flared over discipline, over money, over the future of the children. Don Emilio, aging and weary, withdrew further into himself, his presence in the house growing more spectral with each passing year. The children, left to navigate a world that feared and resented them, clung to each other with a desperation that bordered on obsession. The genetic consequences of such insularity began to show. Some of the children were healthy and bright, but others suffered from ailments that seemed to have no cause: weak hearts, fragile bones, minds that wandered into darkness and could not find their way back. The sisters, haunted by guilt, sought remedies in old superstitions and desperate prayers, but nothing could change the fact that their choices had set their children on a path from which there was no return. Still, there were moments of grace. On summer evenings, the children would gather in the orchard, chasing fireflies and telling stories beneath the stars. In those moments, the weight of the world seemed to lift, and the laughter that rang out was pure and unburdened. But always, the shadows lingered at the edges, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. The Calderón lineage, born of love and desperation, became the most endogamous in the region of family within a family, bound by secrets and blood. The villagers watched from a distance, their fear mingled with fascination, as the children grew into adults and the cycle threatened to begin anew. The house on the hill, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a monument to the price of survival, a place where innocence had been sacrificed on the altar of necessity, and where the echoes of old choices would haunt every generation that followed. It was inevitable, perhaps, that the fragile peace within the Calderón house would not last. The years of secrecy, the weight of shared burdens, and the relentless scrutiny of the village had worn the sisters thin. What began as whispered arguments behind closed doors soon became open conflict. The old bonds of sisterhood fraying under the strain of jealousy and regret. Maria, once the unshakable pillar of the family, grew brittle and sharp. The lines on her face deepened, her voice lost its warmth, and her patience wore away to nothing. She watched her sisters with suspicion, convinced that Lucia was plotting to take Emilio for herself, that Inés was hiding something, some secret alliance, some betrayal waiting to be revealed. The sense of control that had always defined Maria now twisted into a desperate need to dominate, to keep the family from slipping through her fingers. Lucia, for her part, was consumed by longing and resentment. She had always dreamed of a life beyond the village, of love that was hers alone, not parceled out in secret and shame. The years of sharing Emilio, of watching him move from one sister's bed to another, had hollowed her out. She began to seek solace elsewhere, first in the arms of a traveling merchant, then in the bottle. Her laughter, once bright and infectious, became brittle, edged with bitterness. She accused Maria of stealing her happiness, of turning their home into a prison. The arguments between them grew louder, more vicious, echoing through the house and out into the night. Inés, the quietest of the three, was the first to slip into madness. The years of watching, of holding the family's secrets, had left her haunted. She spoke to shadows, wandered the halls at night, and scribbled strange symbols on the walls. The children learned to avoid her, whispering that Aunt Inés could see things no one else could. She became a ghost in her own home, her eyes hollow, her words a jumble of prophecy and fear. Don Emilio, once the center of their world, became a casualty of their unraveling. The man who had once moved so confidently through their lives now seemed diminished, His shoulders stooped, his eyes dull. He tried to keep the peace, to remind the sisters of the love that had once bound them. But his efforts were met with suspicion and scorn. The children, sensing the shift, began to turn against him as well, blaming him for the misery that had taken root in their home. The village, always watchful, could no longer ignore the signs of trouble. The shouting from the Calderón house grew louder, the children more wild and unruly. Stories spread of strange lights at night, of curses muttered in the fields, of chickens found dead with their throats slit. The priest, alarmed by the rumors, paid a visit to the house, only to be turned away by Maria, her eyes blazing with defiance. It was Lucia's disappearance that finally brought matters to a head. One morning, she was simply gone, her bed empty, her belongings untouched. The sisters searched the fields, the woods, the riverbank, but there was no trace of her. Some said she had run away with a lover. Others whispered that she had drowned herself in the river. Maria insisted that Lucia would never abandon her children, but her certainty rang hollow. In the days that followed, the house descended into chaos. Inez's madness deepened, her ramblings growing more frantic. She claimed to see Lucia's ghost in the orchard, to hear her voice in the wind. Maria, desperate to maintain control, lashed out at everyone, her children, her sister, even Emilio. The children, frightened and confused, began to act out, their mischief turning to cruelty. The villagers, sensing that something terrible was unfolding, finally intervened. A group of men, led by the priest and the mayor, marched up the hill. One evening, torches in hand, they found the house in disarray, furniture overturned, windows broken, the air thick with the stench of fear and neglect. Maria met them at the door, her face gaunt, her eyes wild. She refused to let them in, screaming that they had no right, that the Calderón would never be judged by outsiders. But the villagers would not be turned away. They forced their way inside, searching room by room. They found Inez in the attic, rocking back and forth, her hands stained with ink and blood. They found Emilio in the cellar, slumped against the wall, his breath shallow, his body broken by years of disappointment and despair. The children huddled together in the kitchen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. No one spoke of what they found in Lucia's room, the strange symbols scrawled on the walls, the locks of hair tied with red thread, the diary filled with confessions and curses. The villagers left the house in silence, their faces grim, their hearts heavy, with the knowledge that some secrets were better left undisturbed. The Calderón house was sealed, its windows boarded, its doors locked. The children were sent to live with distant relatives, scattered to the winds. Maria was taken away, her mind shattered, her body frail. Inez was left to wander the empty halls, her madness now her only companion. Emilio died not long after, his heart finally giving out. The village tried to move on, but the memory of the Calderóns lingered, a cautionary tale, a warning whispered to children on stormy nights. The house on the hill stood empty, its secrets festering in the darkness, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to seek them out. What price did they pay for their secret? The answer, perhaps, is still echoing in the empty rooms, in the dreams of those who remember. The story of the Calderón sisters did not end with their unraveling. It lives on, a shadow stretching across generations, a reminder that some choices can never be undone. When the dust finally settled over the Calderón house, the village below was left with a silence that felt heavier than any storm. The once mighty family, whose name had been spoken with a mix of awe and fear, was now a cautionary tale, a wound that refused to heal. The house on the hill, its windows boarded and its garden choked with weeds, became a monument to everything the villagers wished to forget and everything they could not. Maria, the eldest, spent her final days in a sanatorium far from Asturias, her mind lost in a labyrinth of memory and regret. She spoke only in fragments, her words circling back to the house, the pact, the children she could no longer name. The nurses pitied her, but the villagers who heard of her fate only shook their heads. She brought it on herself, they muttered, as if blame could shield them from the chill that crept up the hill each night. Inez, left behind in the empty house, became a ghost long before her body gave out. She wandered the halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her eyes fixed on things no one else could see. Some said she was cursed, others that she was simply mad. Children dared each other to peer through the cracks in the boards, to catch a glimpse of the witch of the Calderón house. When Innes finally died, alone and forgotten, the village priest refused to ring the church bell. "Let the dead rest," he said. But the villagers knew better. The dead, in Asturias, never truly rest. The children, scattered to distant relatives and orphanages, carried the Calderón name like a brand. In every new town, every new school, the story followed them, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a shout. Some tried to hide their origins, changing their names, inventing new histories. Others wore their lineage like armor, daring anyone to challenge them. But the past clung to them, shaping their lives in ways they could neither escape nor fully understand. Some of the children grew up strong, determined to prove the world wrong. They became teachers, farmers, even priests, building new lives on the ruins of the old. But others were not so lucky. The scars of their childhood, the secrecy, the suspicion, the sense of being always watched never truly faded. A few fell into darkness, repeating the patterns of isolation and mistrust that had defined their family for generations. The Calderón blood, so tightly woven, carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. The village, for its part, tried to move on. The story of the Calderón became a warning, a tale told to children who strayed too far from home. "Don't go up the hill," mothers would say. "Don't trust outsiders. Don't keep secrets." But beneath the surface, there was a lingering sense of guilt, a recognition that the village itself had played a part in the family's downfall. The whispers, the isolation, the refusal to help, these were wounds that festered in the collective memory, surfacing in nightmares and uneasy glances. Publicly, the Calderóns were condemned, their choices held up as examples of what happens when tradition is defied, when boundaries are crossed. The church preached sermons on the dangers of pride and secrecy, the importance of community and faith. But in private, there were moments of grief, of empathy, of horror at what had been lost. Some remembered Maria's kindness, Lucia's laughter, Innes's quiet wisdom. Some wondered if things might have been different, if only someone had reached out, if only the village had been less quick to judge. The house on the hill remained, its walls crumbling, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and silence. In time, the forest began to reclaim it, ivy creeping up the stones, wildflowers blooming in the cracks. But the legend endured. Travelers passing through would ask about the old house, and the villagers would shake their heads, unwilling to speak of what had happened there. But the children knew. The children always know. The legacy of the Calderón was not just one of horror, but of sorrow, reminder of how easily love can curdle into obsession, how quickly loyalty can become a prison. It was a story of choices made in darkness, of secrets kept too long, of the terrible price paid for survival. And yet, in the quiet moments, there was also a flicker of empathy, a recognition that the Calderóns were not monsters, but people flawed, frightened, desperate to protect what little they had. In the end, the true horror was not in the rituals or the madness, but in the loneliness that haunted every room of the Calderón house. The story of the sisters and their children became a mirror, reflecting the fears and failings of the village itself. And as the years passed and the house faded into ruin, the question lingered: was the Calderón curse a punishment, or simply the echo of a grief too great to bear? The story of the Calderón sisters is not just a tale of one family's downfall. It is a meditation on the boundaries of love, the weight of taboo, and the silent, corrosive power of isolation. In the cold light of hindsight, it is easy to judge the choices made within the walls of that house on the hill. But what if the world outside had been kinder? What if the village had offered compassion instead of suspicion, understanding instead of exile? Love, in its purest form, is meant to bind us together, to offer shelter against the storms of life. Yet, in the Calderón house, Love became a labyrinthine place where devotion twisted into jealousy, where sacrifice bred resentment, and where the need to protect became a prison. The sisters' pact, born of desperation and loyalty, was both an act of courage and a step into darkness. How far would you go to save your family? What lines would you cross if the world left you no other choice? Taboo is a word that carries the weight of centuries. It is the invisible fence that keeps us safe, but also the wall that keeps us apart. The Calderons broke the rules, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Yet the price they paid was steep: isolation, suspicion, and the slow unraveling of everything they held dear. When does a taboo protect, and when does it destroy? Who decides which boundaries are sacred and which are meant to be challenged? And then there is isolation, the silent antagonist in every shadowed room of the Calderon house. Cut off from the world, the sisters turned inward, their secrets festering in the dark. The village, too, suffered from its own isolation, its fear of the unknown, blinding it to the suffering in its midst. How many tragedies are born not from evil, but from the simple act of turning away? So now, I turn these questions to you. If you had been in the Calderon sisters' place, what would you have done? Would you have chosen survival over reputation, loyalty over law? Do you believe the village was right to shun them, or did their silence make them complicit in the family's fate? Where is the line between love and obsession, between tradition and cruelty? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is not just the Calderons' story, it is a story about all of us, about the choices we make when the world closes in, and about the secrets we keep when no one is watching. Thank you for walking these haunted paths with me tonight, for listening to the story that the wind still carries through the valleys of Asturias. The Calderon sisters' legacy is more than a legend. It's a shadow that lingers, a question that refuses to be answered. Their choices, their secrets, and their sorrow have become part of the land itself, woven into every stone and every whispered warning. If this story unsettled you, if it made you question the boundaries of love and the cost of survival, I invite you to share your thoughts below. What would you have done in their place? Do you believe the past can ever truly be buried? Or do some secrets always find a way to return? And if you're drawn to the darkness, if you crave more tales where history and horror entwine, make sure to subscribe and join our community of seekers. Next time, we'll journey even deeper into the forgotten corners of the past, where the line between fact and nightmare is razor-thin. Some say the Calderón bloodline still walks these hills, their eyes watching from the shadows, their story unfinished. Would you dare to meet them? Until then, keep your lanterns lit, your hearts open, and remember, the past is never as far away as we think.